This afternoon we'll be looking at the miracles of the cross, the miracles that took place at this time of the crucifixion. Anybody recognize this mountain? Even if you don't recognize it, you probably know what it is. Okay. I've got all kinds of answers now, but it is Everest. I think Wayne got it. I wish I had a prize for you. Oh, he cheated. Okay, so at least he confessed. Good for him. Yeah. Even if you didn't know, you've heard of it. Everybody's heard of Mount Everest. And the thing is, it's so famous for being what it is that most people, while they could name that one, they don't realize that it is one of so many peaks in that mountain range, some of which are, some of the highest ones, not just Everest. It's the highest from sea level, if you measure it from sea level. But it's a huge mountain range that has so much stuff, and yet nobody knows any of the other ones because all they know is Everest. Everest sort of takes the crown or the attention, and it's so massive and famous that it obscures everything around it. And that is just an illustration pretty much of the way it is with Jesus' death. There's so much happening that we may overlook, or it may be obscured because of just how huge the event itself is. So Jesus on the cross may obscure the significance of some of the miracles that happened while he was on the cross. And we touched on a little bit of it this morning, but we're gonna look a little bit more detailed just for a few minutes here. The darkening, the darkness, the earthquake, the rending of that veil in the temple, and then the opening of the graves that we'll see as well. We didn't say much about it this morning, intentionally. I didn't anyway, because I knew we'd be looking at it today. So, the first one then, darkness. We looked at this one more than the others this morning. What was it that happened? Well, we read how from the 6th hour till the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. There's not really much more for us to say about it here because we pretty much said everything before. But in that first stint, if we want to call it that, for 3 hours, Jesus was it was from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., 12 noon. We saw him praying for his enemies. We saw him speaking to his mother and committing her over to John's care. He was saving that thief. He was probably struggling to breathe. Enemies were casting lots for his garments. The women were weeping, and John seems to have led Jesus' mother away. And there was a lot of things happening. But then, all of a sudden, the activity just seems to have leveled out. Not much happening around Jesus during that last 3 hours. And there's so much that we don't know, like we said this morning. We don't know the extent of the darkness. We don't know how far it spanned. We don't know how deep the darkness was. We don't know a whole lot about it. But what we do know is that it wasn't a natural thing. It wasn't an eclipse. It wasn't a solar eclipse. It wasn't a sandstorm. There is a considerable argument to be made about the plague in Egypt about darkness, that it had something to do with the sandstorm. There's a pretty strong case that could be made with that. Not here, though. Not in this case. It wasn't something like that. And we don't really read about much that happened during this 3 hours of darkness. But it may be that it was so much of an extent that people didn't say much. I mean, it's kind of it would have been a scary moment because it's so unexpected and just in connection with what was happening, it would have caught people's attention. Ominous, yes.
But when the eclipse happens, it's interesting how the nighttime bugs that everything came out from. I mean, there's a real difference between the days.
Yeah. I talked about the bugs this morning. We mentioned the bugs because,
Oh, really?
yes, you were listening, weren't you? You had your can up to the floor listening.
Well, somebody's gonna watch it.
Yeah. Well, you are the one to do that. Yeah. But this lasted for 3 whole hours. So no eclipse lasts for 3 hours. No solar eclipse lasts 3 hours. It's actually a pretty short time. So this was clearly a miracle. But what did it mean? It could be, we talked about some speculations this morning. We won't do that again. But God may have been sending a message that this was not some coincidence or something that was overrun by men, but God was working His own purpose in this. He was fulfilling what He had planned to do for the billions of people on the earth. Some have pointed out that it could be a sign of suffering and sign of struggle, sign of separation. But God drew that mantle over the whole scene for those 3 hours. Obviously, it wouldn't have been pitch blackness. I don't think there's any indication that it was that dark, but darkness. Since it was supernatural, I guess it could have been totally dark. But at any rate, more dark than normal, right in the middle of the day. Kind of puts us in silence too for that same reason, the same reason it may have put them in silence. But the second one that we didn't see much about this morning is an earthquake happened. And this one was probably going to be even more ominous to the people around because of the timing of when it happened. We read earlier this morning how Jesus had made these last declarations, the last 4 of the 7. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he said, I thirst, and they gave him the strong, that sour drink or whatever. Then he said, it is finished. And then he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he breathed his last. His spirit departed from his body, and he died. And at that moment, when Jesus bowed his head and gave up his spirit, the earth starts shaking, quaking. Matthew says, and the earth shook. So much so that the rocks, he says, split apart in some places. And something happened at the temple too, which we'll see in the next miracle that occurred there. But can you imagine the people that were around that were, especially those that were making fun of Jesus, who put him there in the first place, and now he dies. He clearly, his body gives out, and an earthquake just happens. Now the darkness was already happening. Now Jesus gives up his spirit, and the earth starts an earthquake. What are the odds of that? That as soon as as soon as Jesus' spirit leaves his body, an earthquake happens. I didn't think to look up, how common earthquakes are in that part of the world, but even in the places on earth where they are the most frequent, the timing of that is just enough that those people surely were sort of shaken by that, no pun intended, but they would have been. That is just strange for that to have happened, because it seems like such a message from beyond about something major has happened. And especially when you're the one guilty of it, it would really impact you. At any rate, we see that one person was impacted by it and concluded from all these things that were happening that according to, I think it is Matthew's account here, when the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. It's one of those things where, tell us more, please. Give us a little bit more about that. But just reports it as a matter of fact and leaves it at that. We could ask ourselves the question, are we letting God's power change us the way they seem to have been affected by it? God has the power to change, not just touch our hearts, but totally change our lives if we will let Him change our lives. So the earthquake. But then that leads us to this. In fact, it leads us to the next two things, it seems anyway. But especially this one. We're told that the veil at the temple tore in two. Now, it may be a good time for us to ask the question, what is the veil at the temple in the first place? I didn't know there was one. So what difference does it make to me that it tore? Because I don't even know what it is. What is the veil? Okay, a curtain. I guess, yeah, it kind of separated. It separated the two areas, and especially, that was sort of a line of demarcation or whatever you'd call it. You don't pass here. But that it was an important element of the old covenant, the old system. And it was torn in two. Now, the most remarkable thing about this was not when it happened or that it happened, but how it tore. If you remember, whenever Jesus cursed that fig tree, and the next day, or I think it was the very next day, they're walking by that same spot and they see it, and it had withered from the root up, which is totally backwards of the way a tree would normally wither naturally. Well, this being torn from top to bottom is also not the normal way that a curtain of any kind would end up wearing out on its own, but it would be the other way around. This was torn from top to bottom, which is the way that it would be that somebody would tear something probably. You would tear it from the top, at the top down toward the bottom. But if it's going to, from wear and age, be torn, it would wear from the bottom up, just like a tree would wither from, not from the roots. They would be the last things to go. In this case, it shows that this was not just something normally done because of the earth, like an earthquake, but there may have been something bigger going on here. Yes?
So this separated from the holy to the most holy place in the temple? Is that part of it? So how many feet up would that curtain have been?
I think, if I remember right, I believe the Holy of Holies anyway was a perfectly cubed room, so that it is, whatever the dimensions were, it was the same in every direction. So it was the same width as it was long, and I think it was the same height as it was long and wide. Maybe 30 feet? Yeah, it would be a large curtain. That's assuming that the opening was the size of the room, of course. It may not have been. There may have been an entrance that was smaller. But either way, it's not something that we could go to the curtains in our house right now and try to tear them from top to bottom, and unless they're extremely thin and old, it's not going to happen probably. So the curtain that was used for this was probably heavier duty than a typical, because of how important it was to them and what it was meant to represent. But the fact that this happened, actually, I see right here now that you asked that, this, according to this, it says it was 30 feet by 30 feet. So I guess I got lucky with the room measurements, happened to be the curtain measurements, but yes. Okay.
Can you repeat what she said? Because I can't.
She said that like a curtain between separating the men and women, and if that curtain is removed, the men and women would be equal, nothing dividing. Yeah. So once upon a time, that took place. Yeah. So.
Was this separating, saying that the most holy, it kind of broke the barrier of
Yeah, in a part of it is, yeah.
Well, see, what Mary was saying is in current Judaism, when I went to the bar mitzvah of my boss's son, they do have a curtain right down the middle, and the women sit on one side, and the men sit on the other side. But the curtain here was the separation. Man could not even get near the mountain where God was.
Yeah.
Take off your shoes. This is holy ground. The concept of Jesus being Emmanuel, God with us, is something we take for granted. Jews would not have.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine how the priest must have felt sitting in the place where they thought they were the righteous and this is where God dwelt. And man, that thing separated. I mean, the earth wouldn't have to have shook.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of symbolism and you know, just like with a curtain that divides men and women, or a divider of any kind that divides anything, the removal of that would symbolize being done with, I mean, that's no more. That division is no more. And so what it was meant to separate is the separation is gone. So in one sense, you could look at it as separation from God, in the sense of under the new covenant, we are able to draw near to God, whereas like Joe pointed out, under the old covenant that was not the case. And even, you know, God was spoken of to dwell in the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest was allowed to go in there, and only once a year. And the new covenant has a totally different view of man and God, is we're able to draw near to God with boldness. Then there's the idea of that curtain and how it could be representative of the old covenant in general, and it being torn and done with, God doing away with that. And then you could even, like Paul talked about, a middle wall of partition between Gentiles and Jews being removed, so that, kind of like with the men and women, you know, now together. So there's a lot of things going on with that. But ultimately, I think the main symbol of it is removing the old covenant. The end of the old covenant has come. And Jeremiah prophesied it 500 years at least before Jesus, that, I guess I should say God prophesied it through Jeremiah, that he's going to make a new covenant. It's not like the covenant. It's not according to the covenant that he made before, but a new covenant is one that he will make with everybody. And Hebrews 9:16 and 17 points out that where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. A will takes effect only at death, since it's not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Well, we call it the new covenant of Jesus Christ, or the New Testament of Jesus Christ. As long as he's alive, just like with a normal will, as long as the person whoever's will it is alive, the will's not in effect. It's totally null and void. But the implication is when they die, that will goes into effect. And two wills aren't in effect at the same time. So Colossians 2:14 says that God canceled the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. That's clearly a reference to the old covenant because of that reference to legal demands. If he just said the record of debt that stood against us, somebody could say, well, that's probably talking about sin, because that's sort of the record of debt against us. But sin doesn't have legal demands. But the law did. So clearly Paul's talking about the law being nailed to the cross, set aside and nailed to the cross. So that verse is important because it tells us not only that God set aside the old law, but when he set aside the old law was on the cross. Mm-hmm.
You know, in Hebrews, when it uses the word established, that means beyond a doubt. The proof is everywhere. It's established. It's not just guessed. Do you know what I'm saying? It's been proven.
It's fully established.
Exactly.
There are very few people that live on the earth right now that would not know that Jesus Christ died, because it's such a even people who don't believe in him just know. They know the the story, if they want to call it that, and you either just you have to claim it's either made up, that he never existed in the first place, that the man himself was made up, that what happened to him was made up, or, that what happened to him was true, except for the resurrection, but the fact that it has been said to have happened, recorded, for immortalized in record, is fully established. So it is established more than most things. There's never been a single thing that's ever happened since the beginning of time that is more documented and established than the death of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That's a fact. A very important fact, by the way. Nothing has been established and recorded, documented more than that. So if we believe anything that's ever happened, we ought to believe that, because we have no reason to believe anything more than to believe that because of how much more it's been documented and established. So, the rent veil removed the barrier between special priests and ordinary children of God. Now we're all priests. New Testament church, the new covenant, has no priesthood other than everybody. So there are either no priests or all priests, whichever way you want to look at it. Technically speaking, I would say probably all priests, because what the privileges that the priesthood had in the Old Covenant, we all have individually. That's another great blessing of the new covenant. So, what happened next? This is probably the most overlooked of all. It says in Matthew 27, verses 51 through 53, Mark 15:38, I think. Let me double check that, make sure that's not an error. Yeah, that shouldn't be there. That's just for the curtain. Actually, I don't even have it on the screen. I just have it on my thing. So just ignore everything I just said. Matthew's the only one that records it. And it seems to be in connection with the earthquake. Part of it is. There's a very important phrase that we're going to notice. Matthew 27, verses 52 and 53 says, "The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised." And they came out of the tomb. They went into the holy city. And they appeared to many people. That's not something you forget or overlook. Now, if you were dead and buried, and you suddenly found yourself awake again on the earth, for lack of a better word, where would you go? To whom would you go? Probably, most likely. Yeah, people you know. Because why would you go? Why would you go to anywhere else? That's probably what they did. So this is going to be a major event. Now, the key phrase that I referred to is this phrase. After his resurrection. That's a pretty sneaky one in there, isn't it? Because why would Matthew put it here if it didn't happen here? Well, I think the answer to that is it did happen partially. Not all of it, but partially. What happened here? The tombs were open. Why were the tombs open? Because of the earthquake, probably. But it seems that the dead that were in those tombs were not raised until after Jesus was raised. And then they rose. So the earthquake opened the tombs. But then 3 days later, when Jesus' tomb was found empty, his wasn't the only tomb that was empty, but it says many bodies of the saints. Well, who are they? The church hadn't even been established. Who do you think these people were? Okay. Yeah, saved people. They were saints, duh. Says it right there. Yeah, we don't know how long they'd been dead. But the fact that they're called saints, almost every other time in the New Testament, the word saints is interchangeable with Christian. Saints and Christians, they're the same thing. They're not a special class of Christians. Like, well, I'm a Christian, but I hope one day that they'll turn me into a saint. That doesn't exist. That's made up by man in certain religious circles, obviously. But as far as the New Testament is concerned, a Christian is a saint and a saint's a Christian, and you can't be a saint. You can't be a Christian without being a saint. You can't be a saint without being a Christian because they're the exact same thing. So at this time, saints would simply refer to other faithful children of God under the Old Covenant. Joseph would have been one. I'm not saying he was one that was raised, but he would have been in that class of people. Mary, she sort of goes from one side to the other because she lived in both times. We don't know how long she lived after this, but thief on the cross. I hope he wasn't one of them, honestly, because he just got to leave finally. So
I know, but I mean, I looked up the definition, and not the canonized thing, but a person acknowledged as holy or virtuous and typically regarded as being in heaven after death or paradise.
okay, yeah. I think it's a safe definition, yeah.
People who were there.
Yeah, the thief. We don't know how many and which tombs, but they were saved, the righteous dead. Some of them. Again, there's not any indication of a number, but any number of them would have caught headlines because people would have been talking, telling, and then after the first time, the first person starts telling this, people could pass it off. It's like this is crazy. This doesn't happen. They're making this up. They've lost their minds. But then another one comes up, and then another one, and then they've got the people to prove it. If there's any way to prove that they had been dead anyway. But the more people are dead people are being reported as being walking around alive again, that is something that will change a person's life forever in some way, at least make them terrified maybe, but it's the timing of it that where the power is. Jesus was raised. His tomb was found empty, but his tomb wasn't broken open like the other ones were. The earthquake had already happened. He was sealed in a tomb and guarded with extra care, sealed in the sense of a thing, just like a product that you might buy, a gallon of milk or, something like a jar has the little tab thing that is like the pressure or whatever makes it caved in or whatever, and when you open it, it pops that top. All these things are seals of some kind that are meant to show you that it's been opened. It's been tampered with. They would put a seal on it, and to tamper with it would be capital punishment or a very severe punishment. They put that kind of seal on it. Then they guard it. They put a guard out front. Jesus' body was raised. He was raised. And at the time that he was raised, a bunch of other people were raised. Nobody ever talks about this, do they? Maybe it's just because there's not much more to say other than that it happened, and we don't know any other details. But the fact that it happened after his resurrection. If somebody wants to say, well, the disciples came in and stole the body. What's the difference between Jesus' resurrection and all these people's resurrection? Okay, Jesus never died again. Obviously, these people did. Okay, what's another difference?
They didn't say they were going to be raised.
Okay, what's another difference? This is what you get for thinking more than I did. Well, that's true, yeah.
What's interesting,
It's not about his resurrection, but
recognizable bodies.
what's that?
They had to be raised in bodies that were recognizable. Do you know what I'm saying? People would have had to know this person had been dead,
Yeah.
and now they're alive.
Yeah. How did they know they were alive?
They were walking around.
Yeah, see, that's the difference I was getting at. You know, Jesus was gone. He appeared to people, as we're going to see in the next part of this study, the last few lessons. But as far as his body was concerned, he wasn't just standing around, walking around places. You weren't going to run into resurrected Jesus at the market. He wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere until he appeared. These people, they were up walking around in the city. And so you could say the disciples came and stole his body away. They made this up. They had all this planned. What about these people? How are you going to explain these people? Somebody came and stole their bodies and they're using them like puppets, they're marionettes or whatever. They're making them walk and talk. No, that's ridiculous. These people were dead and they're alive again. They were in those tombs and now they're walking out of the tombs. They're not zombies. They're not, animated corpses. They're alive again. So even if they tried to make up a ridiculous story about Jesus, what about these people? So there was, I'm not saying that was the design of it, but that would have been an element of it, because like we talked about this morning, they did try to make up that the disciples came in and stole that body. And that's how it's missing. But they wouldn't be able to use that same excuse for all the other people that raised. The other question we have is, how long were they like Lazarus and they lived until they died again? Or was this like a short temporary thing where it was understood somehow that they come out, they walk in the city or whatever, and like, hi everybody, I'm back, and then then they understand, all right, time to go back in the tomb now and go lay down back in your tomb. It's time. We don't know. I guess the most natural assumption is that much like Lazarus, they would have lived until they died again. But I mean, we just don't know. All we know is what we're told, which is that they were dead. And like we said, they could have been dead for hundreds of years. Doesn't indicate that this was people that just died. They could have been in there for hundreds of years, and now they're alive again. So in that case, the people would have known who they were. But oh yeah, 100 years later. Especially if they came back now, it'd be like, I don't even know where I am. This is not the earth that I left. Yeah. Yeah, I'd rather be dead. I want to be dead again, please. And since all these people were saints, they probably would like, well, this is neat, but can I go back now? And thankfully, eventually, they were able to do that.
Interesting to see, because you're disembodied, the spirit leaves, but now it's put back into a body. Our next body's not going to die, right?
Correct, yeah.
But these guys died again.
Well, I guess we're assuming that they died again. I guess they could have been like Elijah and Enoch, God took them to heaven.
I'll ask him when I get there.
You can tell him. Yeah, if you run into any of these people, hey, they may still be walking around.
I don't think so. It wouldn't do any good.
You may be one of them.
I have been here a long time.
It explains so much. No wonder that's how she knows so much. Well, like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, for some reason the strange doctrine started rolling around that some of them were questioning whether the dead were raised. Dead can't be raised. So he dealt with it in 1 Corinthians 15, and he said, I need to remind you that if the dead are not raised, that means Christ wasn't raised. And if Christ wasn't raised, then we've been preaching for nothing. Our preaching is a lie. It's vain. Our faith is vain. And he says if the dead are not raised and Christ hasn't been raised, then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished without hope. But he says, but in fact, Christ has been raised. So we don't have to worry about any of that because he has been raised. And these bodies rising were just additional testimony not only to the truthfulness of His resurrection, but to the promise of a future resurrection of every saint, everybody being raised from the dead in what Jesus called the resurrection.